In this video, we're going to take a look at Lamy Crystal Amazonite. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. For those that like teal or turquoise inks, I can see this one being loved. It gives a bunch of tone variation by pen and a bunch of shading. It really does look very nice on the page. While teal isn't my thing in colors, I get it. I see this and understand why people enjoy teal and turquoise so much. This ink could be one to change somebody's opinion about that color. And any ink that can change your opinion about a color must be a really good one, even when you've already seen thousands, a thousand or more inks. Really, it's quite good. Looking at the color, I kind of wish I was still using the yellow Rhodia paper because I would be interested in what happens to this color when it's got that yellow background. I think that while it's kind of blue leaning as a teal or turquoise, that with the yellow paper and it becoming a kind of green leaning, which is what I would expect, I think that would look also very nice. So this ink is really a very good one, and I'm happy that Lamy put out some of these other inks in their lines. They've done a good job here. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Conklin word gauge with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine nib has no feather, no spread. It does offer some shading, which you can't help but do because it is kind of a light tone on the page. Medium is much darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, very nice shading throughout the writing, and in all of the words all the time. Now, the stub is darker than we get with the medium, with no feather, no spread, very nice shading. I think this is looking the best for what's here, and that's because I kind of like its darker tone in general combined with the amount of shading that we're getting. But this is a rather wet stub. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, almost no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a D-like Alpha with a medium nib, a Jinhao 159 with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. The fine nib has no feather, no spread. It does look just a tad bit more towards green than we saw in the Clairfontaine, which is really a function of this toned paper. It is shading some, like when you look at the top of the D in good or the bottom of the F's in offices. So we're definitely getting some shading, which is really nice on this paper. Medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, some shading. It's not as good as what we saw with the fine, but it's definitely there. When you look at the U or the T in just, they're darker than the J or the S. And the word beginnings gets to go from a darker to lighter to darker tone. But the tone shifts are very subtle. Now, the stub is darker than the medium with no feather, no spread, only little bits of shading, very little, just like we saw with the medium. When we see the word lectured, the top of the T or the ED are darker than the letters around it. Looking at the back of the page, we get a normal amount of ghosting and no bleed through. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. I think a little bit better shading than what we were seeing on the Leuchtterm. It looks fairly nice here, and we're not getting as much shift towards being a green leaning turquoise or teal as we had with the Leuchtterm, which is strange because they're both about the same tone of paper. So it's an absorbency thing. The medium is darker than the fine with no feather and no spread. It is giving tone variation, that shading. If you look at better, it starts lighter, but at the R, it gets darker. Same with Cardano. Cardano at the upstroke and downstroke of the D to the A is darker than the letters around it. Liked, the letter K gets darker than the rest of the word. So I'm happy that it is giving us some shading. The stub is about the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread. It is shading, and it shades about as well as the medium did, maybe just a little bit more as a characteristic of the nib. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get some minor ghosting, but no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feathering, no spreading, only the tiniest bits of shading. There's really very little, and I can kind of understand it with this paper. It's really the paper causing it. It's not the ink. The ink in general has performed very well. Now, the medium is a little bit darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, a little more shading than what we're seeing in the fine. When you look at the word still, you see the dot of the I is quite dark. The end of the S to the T is darker than the rest of the word, and excited goes from medium to dark to medium to dark to medium in tone. So it absolutely is performing as well as on some other papers, although not as frequently. The stub has no feather, no spread, a few moments of shading. When you look at interference, you see it starts darker and works its way lighter, but on the end of the R, it gets darker again. Again, this is not a paper that tends to have these qualities really stand out. So when they come through at all, it's really helpful. Looking at the back of the page, we get a normal amount of ghosting and no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Document Turquoise. Here is Diamine Tropical Glow. Here is Mont Blanc Blue Hour. Here is Pilot Dew on Pine Tree. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get tiny feathers in a few spots, like the H of that or the C in crossed, but not too much for feathering. They're all really tiny and manageable. We don't experience any kind of spread, and we're certainly seeing some tone variation. When looking at the word notes, it goes from a mid-tone to a darker tone at the TE and back to a mid-tone at S. This paper's not known for its ability to bring out shading, so when it comes through, it speaks highly of the ink. Now, the medium has no feather, no spread, almost no shading whatsoever. So it's not bad. It's a nice color on the page. We're just not really getting a lot of that performance. The stub is darker than the medium. It does feather fairly consistently, but fairly small. It's all got feathers. It's not really spreading. We are seeing some shading. When you look at the word Ben, it starts dark, gets lighter, and gets dark again. Same thing happens with standing. It goes from dark to light to dark. But we're dealing with a dark to darker tone. So it doesn't look like it's as much there, but it certainly is. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and no bleed through corrupting the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a gray ink by Levenger, they're smoky. Here is a brown ink by Krishna, oak. Here is a pink ink by Robert Oster, they're pinky. Here is a black ink by Thornton's, black. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, it does have a lot of little feathers on it. And while it still looks like a fine, we need to remember this is a Japanese fine. So it is experiencing a little bit of spread, about to a Western fine. So not horrible. It does shade some. Saved is much lighter than the word him. The H in Y is much darker than the rest of the word, and it lightens up on the Y. So there is some shading that's coming through. Now, medium is a tad bit darker than the fine. It has no feathering. Just kidding. Plenty of feathering all over it, consistent. In some words, almost to the point of blurry, like when you see the word men. Combining that feathering with the spread that we're experiencing, I don't really care for this. So a wetter medium pen on this paper, probably a bad idea. We're not really getting any shading, but we don't expect it on this paper. The stub has feather, has spread. It actually has a couple moments of color variation, but the feathering and spread are distracting enough that I really don't like how it looks. When we look at the back of the page, we see I've circled some spots where it did dot the page underneath, so it can corrupt the next page, but not to the point of unusable. We get a lot of ghosting, which would be expected, and yes, we did have bleed. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? For me, the best tone and shading came from a wet stub. It's really what made me look at this ink and say, I'm enjoying it a lot more than I would expect. Now, if a wet stub is not your weapon of choice, then I would suggest going with a wet medium pen. Now, that's because you can still get a lot of the great tone and bring out a ton of very nice shading. The thing I would avoid with this ink is a dry pen, and that's of any nib size. And that's because the tone itself gets much, much lighter on the paper. Now, if you prefer a very light teal or turquoise tone, then go for it. But I warned you. I just find that from a drier pen, it's quite a bit lighter than I would prefer. Thanks for watching.